Okay, so Larry asked me to speak and just give a broad overview of a tax appraiser's perspective on property taxes, and so I'm going to do a short and sweet presentation about short and sweet taxes. So I've been doing this for over 30 years, and what I know is that every single taxpayer who comes into my office wants a lower value for their company or their house or their whatever. And nobody looks at the overall perspective of what taxes are. And of course, they're to pay, as you all know, our roads, our schools, our policemen, our firemen, our parks, all the good stuff that everybody wants when they go to the city or the county, but nobody really wants their part to be bigger. So our job, the way I see it, is nothing more than to level out the tax burden. Because what happens is you have a county and they have a budget, and that budget is spread over all of those taxable values that we certify. So coming from Texas, I know Texas property tax code pretty well, but I know most of y'all, or many of y'all, do taxes in a lot of different states, and laws vary from state to state. Generally, for utility and industrial property, my understanding is the overall idea is market value. So what is market value? So I found this and thought, well, that's super interesting. So we all want to avoid paying as much property tax as we can. The legislature sets rules about how much property tax, how we're going to do this. Well, in 1696, England began taxing houses based on the number of windows they had. That led to many houses having very few windows because they didn't want to pay more property tax. Property tax has been around for a really, really long time. Eventually, the unintended consequence of this was that there was a public health problem because houses didn't have enough ventilation because everybody was trying to pay less property tax, and the tax was repealed in 1851. So what we see from that is, and very long ago, is that states established laws of how property taxes are to be assessed. How much is a telecom company worth? How much is a mining company worth? How much is your house worth? So that is established with market value. What is market value? Well, we all know market income cost. I had a tax rep tell me the fourth approach is prior year value, which is true. But also it's whatever the state legislature defines it as. So very often I feel like the tax rep's job is to look at those laws and figure out how they can put a part of the value of their company into a position that's being not taxable. So I was talking to my son. He happens to be a finance professor. And I was talking to him about market value. He said, oh, market value, of course. He said, it's the price an asset would fetch in the marketplace or the value the investment in a community gives to particular equity or business. It's the market capitalization. It's easy. If it's traded on the stock exchange, its value, its market value is the value of its stock. And I had to say, no, that's not how property tax defines market value. So how do we appraise market value on telecom properties? So I kind of broke it down into old and new. Because traditionally you have your old, and I call them old telecom companies, all the Bell companies, Verizon, all the traditional wired companies. And those have always been done on a more or less traditional unit valuation. Then we came in with all the wireless companies. Those companies within our company, have typically been appraised just on some kind of depreciated cost basis. Those are very different appraisal techniques with very different issues and problems to each one. So we have unit value. Okay, what is a unit value? A unit value, as I'm sure you all know, is the value of the company as a whole based on a capitalization of income. But then, what income do you capitalize? And on telecom companies, it's really difficult. It's probably the most difficult unit valuation that we do, because your income to capitalize can include a lot of unusual expenses. It can include write-downs. It can include layoff expenses, because those traditional telecom companies have been in a state of great change over the last 10 or 15 years. They have unusual income, and we've had to deal with, the last speaker talked about the money to the rural areas to do wireless networks, and these governmental programs that subsidize some of the traditional wireline companies. So how much of that income is going to be for the future? Because what we're doing, we're capitalizing the income that's going to go out into the future. How do we adjust the income to reflect those governmental programs that give money to these companies? And we've had a lot of mergers and acquisitions, and so suddenly you have two companies that are now one. How does that income stream work? Of course, you've got the cap rate, which is always a disagreement. And then you have the great value of intangible property. What is the software worth? What is the business value worth? And then you have your federal income tax rate, which was a big change recently, but also how do you adjust for those different variations in the federal income tax? For new wireless companies, we typically used a depreciated cost. We've run into a lot of issues on our replacement costs new when we have, for example, on fiber optic companies, we have fiber optic companies that have purchased other fiber optic companies. When those assets were purchased, the value of those assets was written down and rebooked. Then you also have the value on the assets that weren't rebooked. So you can have two fiber optic lines that are essentially the same line with very different booked cost. So we have to look at how do we make a fair assessment of what those values would be, what those booked costs, what those RCNs. We're also looking at, and this is not a huge value, but shelters. I mean, 20 years ago, we were building, or these companies were building these nice little shelters with big air conditioning units, all this equipment inside, and now a lot of those shelters are not even being used because the current equipment, much of it doesn't require the shelter. So, and that's something we look at from a point of view with our appraisal districts, because what do most appraisal districts appraise? Real estate. So they look at those shelters and goes, is that shelter on the tax roll? It looks like it's this big, and it's, and it has air conditioning, and, so they want it to be on the tax roll. But maybe the value is actually negative because essentially it's serving no purpose at all. And then we have the issue of what kind of depreciation schedule do we use? Equipment changes all the time, as we talked about in this conference. Some of the more modern equipment, traditionally the equipment has had shorter and shorter lives. But nowadays, a lot of the equipment has software upgrades that allows that equipment to be used, the physical hardware, to be used over a longer period of time. We also have a lot of equipment which is outdated but still in use, because I still have my flip phone and I want to be able to use it when I drive to California. So what is the value and use of some of this really old equipment? Then we have the issue, and I'm presenting a lot of issues with no answers here, but that's okay. You can answer them for me if you come to settle values, is categories. So do we have a pointer on here? Yeah. So antennas is probably the only category that all the wireless companies seem to have on their books as a separate thing. But then as far as the other equipment goes, we have LTE RF equipment, computers BTS, antenna systems, cell site computer equipment, digital PCS. I mean, they're just all over the board, and towers is probably the other category that everybody can agree. But now most of the wireless companies don't own their own towers. They're owned by other companies. So one of the things we try to do every year is take all the companies' types of equipment and say, okay, what is a router data equipment for wireless company number 2? I'm not sure. Because we're going to have different schedules on each type of equipment. So what we're trying to do is find out what type of equipment is comparable between the other companies. Because what did I start out at? What's our job? Equalization. It's to say, when we're appraising property for wireless company number 1, that we're appraising the similar kind of property at the same level that we're appraising wireless company 2, 3, and 4. Because that's our job. It's not to make a higher value. It's to make sure that these wireless companies' properties are appraised in a similar manner. So, this is my next to last slide, and these problems have been coming up, and some of them are crazy. Some of them are double assessments, and we've had this this happens not infrequently with wireless companies, that we have a tower company that reports a tower, and we can have a wireless company that reports a tower. So we have our leased equipment. We'll have a leasing company that reports equipment, and then the company that leases it reports equipment. And in Texas, those double assessments, when they come up after certification, cause a lot of problems for the taxing entities after the values are certified. Late notification of ownership. Please tell us if you have sold your company or you sold the equipment. Don't rely on the new company to tell us that. Tell us, hey, we've sold this maybe a certain location, or we've sold whatever, a certain fiber optic lines. Tell us when you've sold your equipment. We don't want to hear about it in September, October, November, December, when we have to go through a lot of different hoops to change those values. And I don't think any of you have a problem with late protests, but that's another issue that we've had from some other types of companies. Make sure we have the correct mailing address and department. If equipment is removed, please note on your rendition that equipment at that location is removed, please. Because what we generally do, if you don't tell us it's gone, we're going to leave it on. That's not all. There's some exceptions to that when we work with companies and we get electronic renditions and that kind of thing. But I was just at an ARB hearing for a company that had equipment, had removed it. We had left it on for 2017. They came back in 2019 and said, hey, that equipment was gone. Well, thank you for telling me now. And within Texas law, you can go back 5 years. If the equipment was actually gone, you can get a refund on your taxes. So please just tell us, because I'm not going to assume that just because somebody failed to render that means their equipment's gone. So please, on your rendition, put, if this location is closed, not every little piece, but if you close a location, please write on there, this location is no longer functional, we move the equipment or whatever. So please tell us about that so we can get it off in time. If we work, in Texas, our busy season is April through July. So if you can give us that information in that time period, April through July, everything's great. We certify values in July, sometime around the 15th to the 20th. And after that, the taxing entities take that value and they go, okay, our budget's $1 million. We've got $20 million in taxable certified value, the tax rate's going to be X. What would that be? 2.02%, or no, 0.002. But at any rate, okay, those values are set. If you file a protest after certification and the money has to be given back, that means that that's coming directly out of the taxes that taxing entity was ready to collect. And they funded teachers with it, they funded roads with it, they funded salaries, they funded things with it. So please just keep in mind that time frame. We start in January, so January through 15 July is a good time to tell us anything you want to tell us. And then number 6 seems duh. Don't render property that's removed. So this has come up repeatedly in the last few years, where companies have actually rendered property, come back after certification and goes, oops, the company just told me that even though I rendered it, that property was removed. So I'm assuming none of y'all have done that. Please don't do it. It's very upsetting, particularly if it's a lot of value. It's upsetting, period. So don't do that. Thank you for listening. Any questions? Okay, I think it's time for lunch. Thank you.